Welcome back, everybody. If you are a returning viewer, thank you, genuinely. Your support keeps this channel going, and it means more than you know. And if this is your first time here, welcome. You landed on this channel on a very good day, because today's story is one of the most fascinating, most disturbing, and most unbelievable true stories we have ever covered on this channel. No fiction writer could make this up. No Hollywood scriptwriter would dare put all of this in one movie because audiences would say it was too much. But it all happened. Every detail you are about to hear is real. Today we are talking about Al Capone, the man who turned organized crime into a corporation, turned Chicago into his personal kingdom, and became so powerful that the President of the United States had to hold a secret White House meeting just to figure out how to take him down. Let's go. To understand Al Capone, you first have to understand Chicago. In the 1920s, Chicago was the second largest city in the United States. It was a city built on ambition, a place where steel workers, slaughterhouse laborers, railroad men, and factory workers all crowded together in neighborhoods divided by ethnicity, language, and class. Italians on one block, Irish on the next, Polish families, Jewish families, black families who had migrated up from the South looking for a better life. It was loud, chaotic, and alive. But Chicago also had a problem that made it uniquely vulnerable to what was coming. And that problem was corruption. Chicago's city government in the early 20th century was one of the most openly corrupt in American history. Politicians openly sold favors. Police officers openly took bribes. Judges made decisions based on who was paying them, not what the law said. The city ran on a system of informal deals, backroom agreements, and cash payments that everyone knew about and almost nobody talked about publicly. This wasn't hidden, it was just accepted. For a normal city, this level of corruption leads to inefficiency and frustration. Some roads don't get fixed. Some contracts go to the wrong companies. Some guilty men walk free. But when Prohibition arrived, when the United States government made alcohol illegal overnight and created the most profitable black market in American history, Chicago's corruption didn't just create problems. It created Al Capone. Because in a city where everything was for sale, a man with enough money, enough intelligence, and enough willingness to use violence could buy anything. The police, the courts, the mayor's office, the city council, all of it. And that is exactly what Al Capone did. But before he could buy Chicago, he first had to survive Brooklyn. Alphonse Gabriel Capone came into the world on January 17, 1899, in a crowded tenement apartment in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. His parents, Gabriele and Teresa Capone, had arrived in America from Naples, Italy 6 years earlier in 1893. They were part of a massive wave of Italian immigration that brought millions of Southern Italians to American cities during that era. They carried with them nothing but their labor, their language, and their hope. Gabriele Some say she struck him. Others say it was a severe verbal humiliation. What all accounts agree on is what happened next. Al Capone hit her back. He was expelled immediately and permanently. He never walked into a school building as a student again. His formal education ended at the 6th grade. And from that day forward, everything Al Capone would learn, he would learn on the streets of Brooklyn. And the streets of Brooklyn had a great deal to teach him. After his expulsion, Capone did what most young men in his neighborhood did when school was no longer an option. He found whatever work he could. He worked at a candy store. He took shifts at a bowling alley. For a period, he worked in a munitions factory. These were honest jobs, the kind of work that paid just enough to survive, but not enough to ever get ahead. The problem was that Al Capone didn't want to survive. He wanted to thrive. He was watching the men around him, the ones who had nice clothes, who walked with confidence, who commanded respect when they entered a room. Those men weren't working in candy stores or munitions factories. They were running the streets. They were in the gangs. So Capone joined them. He started with small neighborhood crews, the 40 Thieves Juniors and the Brooklyn Rippers. These were entry-level criminal organizations, mostly involved in petty theft, street fights, and low-level extortion. But Capone had a quality that set him apart from most of the other young men in these crews. He was disciplined. He was observant. And he was not afraid of anything. These qualities caught the attention of a man who would become the single most important figure in Al Capone's rise. His name was Johnny Torrio. Johnny Torrio was unlike any gangster Capone had met before. He was quiet, methodical, and almost professorial in his approach to crime. He rarely raised his voice. He almost never used violence himself. But he organized crime with the precision of a corporate executive, and he had a gift for identifying talented young men and putting them to work. Torrio was connected to the 5 Points Gang, one of New York's most powerful criminal organizations, and he was also the nephew of a Chicago crime lord named James Colosimo, known on the streets as Big Jim, who ran a massive network of gambling dens, brothels, and extortion rackets across the Chicago underworld. When Torrio spotted Capone in Brooklyn, he saw exactly what he was looking for. A young man with brains, fearlessness, and hunger. He brought Capone into the organization. He then introduced him to a trusted lieutenant named Frankie Yale, who managed several of Torrio's Brooklyn bars and establishments. Under Yale's supervision, Capone went to work. His first real job in the criminal world was simple: stand at the door, keep trouble out, make sure business runs smoothly. It was not glamorous, but it was an education. And Capone was paying close attention to every lesson. Then came the night that gave him a nickname he would spend the rest of his life hating. In 1917, at one of Frankie Yale's establishments in Brooklyn, where Capone was working the door, a young woman named Lena came in for the evening with her brother, Frank Galluccio. Capone noticed Lena across the room, and instead of keeping his thoughts to himself, he said something about her appearance, something inappropriate and offensive. Lena's brother heard it. Frank Galluccio was not a large man. He was not a particularly powerful man. But he was a proud man, and he had just heard a stranger make a crude comment about his sister in public. He pulled out a knife. Before anyone could intervene, Galluccio slashed Capone 3 times across the left side of his face. 3 deep cuts that required 30 stitches to close. 3 wounds that healed into permanent, highly visible scars that ran along Capone's jawline. Capone was furious. The humiliation of the attack was worse than the physical pain. He wanted Galluccio dead. But Johnny Torrio intervened. He told Capone to let it go. He brokered a peace between the 2 men, and eventually Capone was even required to apologize to Galluccio. Years later, when Capone was running Chicago, he would actually put Galluccio on his payroll as a bodyguard, perhaps the most ironic employment decision in gangster history. But the scars never faded. The press, when they eventually discovered them, started calling him Scarface. Capone despised the nickname with a passion that lasted his entire life. He believed it was disrespectful, a label that reduced him to his appearance rather than his accomplishments. In every photograph he ever allowed, he turned his left side away from the camera. When anyone asked about the scars in public, he had a practiced answer ready. He said he had earned them serving with the Lost Battalion during World War I. He said they were war wounds. Neither part of that story was remotely true, but it was the story he told. And in the 1920s, when veterans were widely respected, it kept most people from asking follow-up questions. The scars stayed. The nickname stayed. And the man they called Scarface kept building toward something much, much larger. Around the same period, something happened to Al Capone that had nothing to do with crime or violence or power. He fell in love. Her name was Mary Josephine Coughlin. Everyone called her May. She was Irish-American, lived in the same Brooklyn neighborhood, and by all accounts was a quiet, decent, deeply loyal young woman who saw something in the intense young Italian man from down the block that she chose to build her life around. Their relationship moved fast, too fast by the standards of that era. May became pregnant before they were married, and on December 4, 1918, she gave birth to their son, Albert Francis Capone, whom the family called Sonny. 26 days after his son was born, Al Capone married May Coughlin. He was 19 years old. Becoming a father changed something in Capone, at least for a while. He looked at his son and felt, perhaps for the first time, a genuine reason to be someone other than a street tough with ambitions. He wanted stability for his family. He wanted something legitimate. He moved his family to Baltimore, Maryland, and took a job as a bookkeeper at a construction company called the Snyder and Quinn Firm. religious groups, and progressive reformers who believed that alcohol was destroying American families and communities. Their intentions, by and large, were genuine. Their results were catastrophic. Within days of Prohibition taking effect, every licensed bar, saloon, and brewery in America was forced to shut down. Workers lost jobs. Business owners lost everything they had built. And the demand for alcohol, which had existed for as long as human civilization, did not disappear. It went underground. Bootleggers began producing and distributing illegal liquor almost immediately. Speakeasies, illegal bars hidden behind unmarked doors, down basement stairways, behind fake bookcase entrances, began appearing across every American city. Supply chains stretched from Canadian distilleries to Caribbean rum runners to basement stills in American neighborhoods. Beer that used to cost $5 a barrel before Prohibition now sold on the black market for $55. The profit margins were extraordinary, and the demand was essentially unlimited. In Chicago, the situation was particularly extreme. Chicagoans had always been heavy drinkers. By some estimates, they consumed nearly 3 times the national average of alcohol before Prohibition, and Chicago's government was already deeply structurally corrupt. The infrastructure for paying off officials, for running illegal operations in the open, for operating outside the law with the law's quiet permission, it all already existed. Johnny Torrio looked at this situation and saw the greatest business opportunity of his life. But there was one obstacle standing directly in his path, and that obstacle was the man who had built the Chicago underworld in the first place, his own uncle, Big Jim Colosimo. James Colosimo, Big Jim, was the undisputed king of Chicago's criminal underworld when Prohibition began. He had built his empire from nothing, starting with small-scale vice operations and expanding over 2 decades into a sprawling network of brothels, gambling houses, and political connections. He was known for the diamonds he kept in his coat pockets, distributing them casually as gifts and bribes, which earned him his other nickname, Diamond Jim. Big Jim had everything a man in his position could want: money, power, respect, and he had recently fallen deeply in love. He had divorced his longtime wife and business partner, Victoria, and married Dale Winter, a young singer nearly 30 years his junior. He was, by all accounts, in a state of personal contentment, and personal contentment made him cautious. When Johnny Torrio came to his uncle with the bootlegging plan, outlining how they could make fortunes supplying illegal alcohol to a city desperate for it, Big Jim refused. Not because he had moral objections, he had none, but because he had built what he had carefully, and he did not want to risk it on something new. The federal government was involved now. The risks were different. Torrio argued. Colosimo refused. Again and again, the conversation ended the same way. Torrio made a decision. On May 11th, 1920, Big Jim Colosimo walked into his own restaurant on South Wabash Avenue in Chicago to receive what he believed was a routine whiskey delivery. Instead, he was shot once in the back of the head as he stood in the lobby. He died immediately. The murder was never officially solved, but the underworld knew exactly who had ordered it. Johnny Torrio had arranged for Frankie Yale, Capone's old mentor from Brooklyn, to come to Chicago and carry out the killing. Some accounts suggest Capone was also present. With Big Jim gone, Torrio stepped into his place as the head of the Chicago outfit, also known as the South Side Gang. He immediately launched into the bootlegging business with full force. And beside him, running operations, managing men, and handling the violence that inevitably came with the territory, was Al Capone. The empire was open for business. Johnny Torrio was, in many ways, the perfect teacher for Al Capone. Torrio had a philosophy about organized crime that was almost unusual in its sophistication. He believed that violence was a tool, a necessary one, but a tool that should only be used when every other option had failed. His preference was always negotiation, business deals, territorial agreements, peace between competing factions that allowed everyone to make money without the cost and attention that came with constant warfare. His famous line, delivered to rivals and partners alike, was simple: "We don't want to have any trouble if we can help it." Under Torrio's guidance, Capone learned to think of crime as a business, not a series of robberies or random acts of violence, but an organized, structured operation with employees, territories, supply chains, revenue streams, and long-term strategy. The bootlegging operation they built together was extraordinary in its scale. Because alcohol couldn't legally be produced inside the United States, they built a distribution network that stretched into Canada. Canadian bootleggers supplied quality whiskey and beer that was then smuggled across the border, through the Great Lakes, across land crossings in the northern states, by truck and by boat, and distributed to speakeasies, restaurants, hotels, and private buyers throughout Chicago and beyond. They also operated breweries that produced beer illegally right inside Chicago, hidden in warehouses, disguised as legitimate businesses, protected by paid-off inspectors who never seemed to find anything worth reporting. The money that came in was staggering. By 1924, the operation was generating an estimated $5 million every single month. Capone was making more money in a week than most Americans made in a decade. He bought a home for his family, a 2-story, 6-bedroom house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in the Park Manor neighborhood of Chicago. He moved his mother, his wife, his son, and several of his brothers into Chicago. 3 of his brothers became directly involved in the organization. James, Ralph, and Frank each took on specific roles managing different parts of the operation. It was a family business in the most unconventional sense possible. And Capone was just getting started. Johnny Torrio was, in many ways, the perfect teacher for Al Capone. Torrio had a philosophy about organized crime that was almost unusual in its sophistication. He believed that violence was a tool, a necessary one, but a tool that should only be used when every other option had failed. His preference was always negotiation, business deals, territorial The money that came in was staggering. By 1924, the operation was generating an estimated $5 million every single month. Capone was making more money in a week than most Americans made in a decade. He bought a home for his family, a 2-story, 6-bedroom house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in the Park Manor neighborhood of Chicago. He moved his mother, his wife, his son, and several of his brothers into Chicago. 3 of his brothers became directly involved in the organization. James, Ralph, and Frank each took on specific roles managing different parts of the operation. It was a family business in the most unconventional sense possible. And Capone was just getting started. Johnny Torrio was in many ways the perfect teacher for Al Capone. Torrio had a philosophy about organized crime that was almost unusual in its sophistication. He believed that violence was a tool, a necessary one, but a tool that should only be used when every other option had failed. His preference was always negotiation, business deals, territorial agreements, peace between competing factions that allowed everyone to make money without the cost and attention that came with constant warfare. His famous line, delivered to rivals and partners alike, was simple: "We don't want to have any trouble if we can help it." Under Torrio's guidance, Capone learned to think of crime as a business, not a series of robberies or random acts of violence, but an organized, structured operation with employees, territories, supply chains, revenue streams, and long-term strategy. The bootlegging operation they built together was extraordinary in its scale. Because alcohol couldn't legally be produced inside the United States, they built a distribution network that stretched into Canada. Canadian bootleggers supplied quality whiskey and beer that was then smuggled across the border, through the Great Lakes, across land crossings in the northern states, by truck and by boat, and distributed to speakeasies, restaurants, hotels, and private buyers throughout Chicago and beyond. They also operated breweries that produced beer illegally right inside Chicago, hidden in warehouses, disguised as legitimate businesses, protected by paid-off inspectors who never seemed to find anything worth reporting. The money that came in was staggering. By 1924, the operation was generating an estimated $5 million every single month. Capone was making more money in a week than most Americans made in a decade. He bought a home for his family, a 2-story, 6-bedroom house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in the Park Manor neighborhood of Chicago. He moved his mother, his wife, his son, and several of his brothers into Chicago. 3 of his brothers became directly involved in the organization. James, Ralph, and Frank each took on specific roles managing different parts of the operation. It was a family business in the most unconventional sense possible. And Capone was just getting started. As the undisputed head of the Chicago outfit, Capone didn't inherit a criminal gang. He built a criminal corporation. He expanded the organization aggressively, reaching into communities across Chicago that previous leadership had ignored. He recruited members from the black community, from immigrant neighborhoods across the city, and forged formal alliances with criminal organizations in other American cities. He was thinking nationally, at a time when most gangsters were still thinking block by block. By 1926, over 1,000 people worked for the Chicago outfit in various capacities: drivers, enforcers, lookouts, accountants, bartenders, warehouse managers, corrupt officials on the payroll. The weekly salary bill alone exceeded $300,000. $300,000 every week in 1926. Capone ran this operation with a corporate executive's attention to structure and loyalty. He had department heads for different parts of the business. He had financial managers who tracked income and expenses. He had operations people who managed the distribution network and the speakeasies. And he had a rule about loyalty that he stated plainly and enforced absolutely. "My men are loyal to me because they fear me," he reportedly said. And it was true. Working for Capone paid extraordinarily well. But betraying Capone, talking to police, skimming from the operation, providing information to rivals, meant death. Not a quick, merciful death. A death designed to send a message to everyone watching. Capone established his headquarters in a lavish suite at the Metropole Hotel in downtown Chicago. From here, he ran his empire, received visitors, held meetings, and conducted business. The hotel suite was heavily guarded at all times. He also built a highly visible, carefully managed public persona. He wore custom-tailored suits, silk, expensive, always impeccably maintained. He carried diamond stick pins and wore rings that caught the light. He smoked long Cuban cigars. He drove armored automobiles. He attended jazz clubs, baseball games, boxing matches, and horse races, always with a crowd, always visible, always performing the role of a man who had nothing to hide. The press loved him. The newspapers covered his every movement. He was good copy, charming, quotable, and completely unlike any criminal the public had seen before. He didn't look like a desperate man. He looked like success. When reporters pushed him on his criminal enterprise, he smiled and said, "I'm just a businessman, giving the people what they want." The public, exhausted by prohibition and quietly resentful of a government that had taken away their beer and whiskey, found this argument surprisingly persuasive. A significant number of ordinary Chicago residents genuinely liked Capone, or at least found it difficult to see him as the villain the federal government was painting him to be. He was, in many ways, America's first celebrity criminal. And at the height of his power, his annual income was estimated at $100 million. Money buys many things. Al Capone knew exactly what he wanted to buy with his. He bought Chicago. Not literally, of course, but in every practical sense that mattered. Capone purchased the machinery of Chicago's government and made it work for him rather than against him. His bribery operation was systematic and thorough. He didn't simply pay off individual police officers when they arrested his men. He paid department heads, who ensured that entire When the county judge sent 70 police officers to stop the fraud, Capone's brother Frank opened fire on the arriving cars, believing they were rival gangsters. The police returned fire and killed Frank Capone on the street. The election was still stolen. Their candidate still won. In 1926, Capone ordered the public daytime assassination of William McSwiggan, a respected prosecutor nicknamed the Hanging Prosecutor for his success rate in obtaining convictions. McSwiggan had been building a murder case against Capone. He was shot dead on a sidewalk in Cicero. No one was ever charged. In 1927, Capone poured enormous resources into the Chicago mayoral campaign of William Hale Thompson, who had long been a political ally. When Thompson's opponents proved competitive, Capone's men conducted a bombing campaign through their neighborhoods, blasting campaign offices, intimidating supporters, making it clear that opposing Thompson came with physical consequences. 15 people died in the bombings. The terrified Chicago electorate voted for Thompson in overwhelming numbers. Thompson won. And Chicago now had a mayor who answered to Al Capone. The parallel government was complete. Capone ran the streets. His allies ran City Hall. His money ran the courts. His violence ran the neighborhoods. Chicago was his city. In every sense that mattered, it was completely his. By early 1929, the long war between Capone's South Side organization and the North Side gang had consumed years, dozens of lives, and enormous resources on both sides. Of the original North Side leadership, only one man remained, George Clarence Moran, known on the streets as Bugs. Jaime Weiss had been killed in 1926. Vincent Drucci had been shot dead by police in 1927. Moran was the last, and he was still fighting, still running bootlegging operations that competed directly with Capone's, still talking openly and disrespectfully about Capone to anyone who would listen. Capone decided to end it permanently. The plan was elaborate and carefully constructed. Capone's men rented an apartment on North Clark Street, directly across from a red brick garage at number 2122 that served as Moran's headquarters and distribution center. For weeks, they watched the garage, tracking who came and went, learning the rhythms of its operation. They arranged for a trusted contact to call Moran's men and alert them to a delivery of hijacked Canadian whiskey, exactly the kind of offer Moran's organization regularly pursued. The delivery was set for the morning of February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day. That morning, 7 of Moran's men arrived at the garage on Clark Street expecting whiskey. What they found instead was a trap, perfectly designed to look like something routine. A police vehicle pulled up to the garage. 4 men got out, 2 dressed as uniformed police officers, 2 in plain clothes. The 7 men inside, seeing what appeared to be a police raid, did what experienced gangsters did in that situation. They cooperated. They lined up against the garage wall. They waited to be searched, cited, or shaken down for a bribe. Instead, the 4 men raised Thompson's submachine guns and opened fire. The shooting lasted only seconds. 7 men fell against the blood-soaked wall of the garage. 6 died immediately. The 7th, Frank Goosenberg, was found by actual police officers still breathing, with 14 bullets in his body. When a detective leaned down and asked who had done this, Gusenberg gave the only answer that the street code permitted. "Nobody shot me," he said. He died 3 hours later. Bugs Moran himself had been running late that morning. He arrived near the garage just as the fake police car pulled up, recognized something was wrong, and turned and walked away. He was the only member of his organization who survived. When reporters later asked Moran who was responsible, he stated it plainly. "Only Capone kills like that." The St. Valentine's Day massacre was front-page news across the entire country. 7 bodies lined up against a garage wall, machine gun casings scattered across a blood-soaked concrete floor. Photographs that shocked even a public that had grown somewhat accustomed to Chicago's ongoing gang violence. This was different. This was something that could not be ignored, explained away, or bought off with another round of bribes to another set of officials. The massacre changed everything. President Herbert Hoover read about it in the newspapers and decided once and for all that Al Capone had to be stopped. The challenge facing the United States government was not identifying Al Capone as the source of Chicago's violence and corruption. That part was obvious to everyone. The challenge was proving it in a court of law, in a way that would survive appeal, hold up against the best defense lawyers money could buy, and result in a sentence significant enough to actually remove Capone from power. Every direct approach had failed. Murder charges evaporated before they reached trial. Bootlegging charges disappeared when witnesses changed their stories or simply vanished. Corruption charges couldn't be built because the very officials who would investigate them were on Capone's payroll. President Hoover, deeply embarrassed by the international attention that the Valentine's Day massacre had brought to American organized crime, called a secret meeting at the White House. He gathered the heads of multiple federal agencies and gave them a single directive: get Capone, by any means available within the law. 2 separate federal efforts emerged from that meeting. The first was led by Elliot Ness, a young agent with the Prohibition Bureau, who assembled a team of agents specifically selected because they were believed to be immune to bribery. Men with clean records, no known connections to Chicago's Underworld, and no financial vulnerabilities that Capone's people could exploit. The press eventually gave Ness's team a nickname that stuck in American history: the Untouchables. Ness and his team went after Capone's brewing and distillery operations directly. They raided warehouses and hidden breweries across Chicago, seizing equipment, destroying product, and building a factual record of the scale of Capone's bootlegging enterprise. The raids made headlines and humiliated Capone. sentence, something minor, in exchange for a plea agreement. The government declined. He attempted to interfere with the jury selection process, bribing potential jurors before the trial began. The government learned of this and, in a dramatic last-minute maneuver, switched the entire jury panel the morning deliberations was set to start, replacing it with a panel that Capone's people had not had time to approach. The trial lasted 2 weeks. On October 17, 1931, the verdict came in. Al Capone was found guilty on 5 counts of federal income tax evasion. The judge sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, a fine of $50,000, and court costs of an additional $30,000. The man who had never been convicted of murder, the man who had ordered hundreds of deaths and watched the cases disappear, the man who had purchased an entire city's government. He was going to prison for not paying his taxes. Al Capone entered the federal prison system in May 1932, beginning his sentence at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. He was not a model prisoner in Atlanta. Despite being behind bars, Capone still had an enormous reputation, enormous resources, and enormous motivation to remain connected to his operations in Chicago. He received preferential treatment from sympathetic guards, hosted visitors extensively, and made clear to anyone paying attention that his incarceration had not severed his connections to the outside world. Federal officials noticed, and they made a decision. In August 1934, Capone was transferred to a federal penitentiary that had just recently opened on a small rocky island in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz, the Rock, as it came to be called, was designed specifically to house the prisoners that other institutions could not adequately contain. It was isolated, a boat ride from the mainland, with strong and unpredictable currents in the surrounding bay that made unauthorized departure essentially impossible. Its staff was carefully screened and well paid, making them significantly harder to corrupt. Visitation was strictly limited. Communication with the outside world was severely restricted. For the first time in his adult life, Al Capone found himself in a situation his money could not buy his way out of. But there was something else happening to Capone that no prison cell had caused, and no amount of money or influence could fix. Years before his arrest, at some point in the 1920s, Capone had contracted syphilis. In the era before antibiotics, syphilis was a progressive and ultimately fatal disease that, if left untreated long enough, attacked the brain and central nervous system. The condition, called neurosyphilis, caused cognitive decline, confusion, erratic behavior, and a gradual deterioration of mental function. By the time Capone reached Alcatraz, the disease had already been advancing for years. Prison officials and medical staff began documenting his declining mental state. He would sometimes be found in his cell, confused about where he was. He would have conversations that wandered off in unexpected directions. He would behave at times more like a lost and bewildered old man than the calculating crime lord who had once run the second city of the United States. The most feared gangster in American history was being brought down not by the law, not by a rival bullet, but by a microscopic organism that had been quietly destroying his brain for over a decade. His fellow prisoners on Alcatraz sometimes called him Behind his back, not to his face, Snorky. It was an old nickname from his Chicago days, a term for someone who dressed well. But on Alcatraz, it carried a different weight. It was the sound of a legend diminished. Capone was released from Alcatraz in January 1939, having served 6.5 years of his 11-year sentence, with the remainder reduced for good behavior. He spent several additional months in a Pennsylvania prison, completing the legal details of his release, and was finally a free man in November 1939. He was 40 years old, but in almost every meaningful sense, the man who walked out of prison was not the same man who had walked in. He returned to his Palm Island estate in Miami, Florida, a beautiful waterfront property he had purchased at the height of his power. May was there. His family was there. And for the most part, that was the extent of his world from that point forward. The Chicago outfit had reorganized during his imprisonment. New leadership had stepped in. The organization continued. In fact, it thrived for decades after Capone's fall, but it no longer needed or wanted its most famous former boss involved. He was a liability, a name that attracted attention. Al Capone spent his final years in Palm Island, increasingly withdrawn from the world, his mental state continuing to deteriorate. He fished. He tended to his garden. He had good days and bad days, and as the years passed, the bad days came more frequently. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone suffered a cardiac arrest at his Palm Island estate. He died the following day. He was 48 years old. Al Capone has been dead for nearly 80 years, and yet his name is still instantly recognizable to people around the world. His face has appeared on magazine covers, movie posters, documentary thumbnails, and textbook illustrations for nearly a century. He has been portrayed in film more times than almost any other real historical figure in American history. He has given his name to a cultural archetype, the sharply dressed, charismatic, utterly ruthless organized crime boss who operates above the law by purchasing the law itself. Why does this story continue to captivate us so completely? Part of the answer is the sheer scale of what he built. Al Capone came from nothing. His parents were immigrants who arrived in America with nothing but their hands and their hope. He dropped out of school at 14. He had no formal training, no elite connections, no inherited wealth or advantage of any kind. And from those beginnings, he built a criminal organization that generated $100 million a year, employed over 1,000 people, and effectively controlled the government of the second-largest city in the United States. He did this in less than a decade. real human beings with real families, and their deaths were Al Capone's responsibility. But it does complicate the simple story of the evil gangster versus the good society that tried to stop him. The society that tried to stop him had created the conditions that made him possible. That is an uncomfortable fact, and it is part of why the story has never fully resolved itself in the American cultural imagination. There is also the simple fact that his fall was almost poetically ironic. The man who survived hundreds of assassination attempts, the man who ordered over 200 murders and was never charged for a single one, the man who bribed every official who might have put him away, the man who intimidated every witness who might have testified against him. He was brought down by an IRS form he never filed. The law he had purchased and corrupted and made irrelevant in every area that directly threatened him. That same law found one tiny corner he had forgotten to cover, and that corner was enough. Al Capone left behind a criminal organization that continued operating under new management for decades. He left behind a template for organized crime that influenced criminal organizations across the country. He left behind a thoroughly corrupted Chicago political system that took generations to partially clean up. He left behind a pop culture mythology that has never stopped generating new films, books, and documentaries. And he left behind, in the quiet corridors of American history, a question that his story has never entirely answered. If the society that created the conditions for Al Capone's rise had made different choices, if prohibition had never happened, if Chicago's government had not already been structurally corrupt, if the system had been more honest and less for sale, would there have been an Al Capone at all? Or would he simply have been a very smart, very driven man who found a different way to make his mark on the world? We will never know. What we do know is this: a sixth-grade dropout from a Brooklyn already subscribed to this channel, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button right now. We cover stories exactly like this one. Deep dives into history's most extraordinary, most complicated, most unforgettable, real human lives. You do not want to miss what is coming next. And if this video gave you something, if it made you think, if it shocked you, If it taught you something you didn't know before, share it. Send it to a friend. Leave a comment below telling us which part of Capone's story hit you the hardest. We read every single comment. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and we will see you in the next one.